Hi, Joe. Nice
Hi,
to see you
Tanya.
again.
Hi,
Uh,
Tanya.
we're doing our first podcast from me moving to Australia. And Joe, I guess you're in the UK. We were just talking about the difference in climate in different places, which I think is an interesting place to start. So I'd like to start by just giving you a really big thank you. We also talked about it being the end of the year. We're recording in December, and it's quite a crazy time of year. So it's really generous of you to agree to do this podcast, but particularly now when everyone's so busy and so stretched. And so we really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
And really looking forward to the chat. So I'd like to start just by introducing you and reading out a little bit from your bio. I'm going to shorten it and leave some of it for the discussion, but there are a few points that I just wanted to set the scene with. So Dame Jo de Silva has earned global recognition as an engineer who has led pioneering research and developed projects globally that result in more sustainable and resilient communities, cities, and infrastructure. Her role at Arup is Global Director, Sustainable Development, and Officer to the Arup Group Board, leading business transformation in response to climate, biodiversity, and equity crisis. There's so much there. I thought my new title and my new job was long, but this is, about three times longer. So we have a lot to talk about. Let me just finish your bio with some of your different recognitions, achievements, and celebrations, because I think they're so diverse, and we'll also dig into that. She's an honorary fellow at Sydney, Sussex, Cambridge, and has an honorary doctorate in humanitarian engineering from Coventry University and built environment from South Bank University. We're here because Jo was awarded the gold medal by the Institution of Structural Engineers in 2017 and has also been recognised as a Royal Designer for Industry for Sustainable Design. She was made a Dame Commander of the British Empire in 2021 New Year's Honours for services to engineering and international development. And we'll get into some of those a little bit later in our chat. So welcome. Early in my career when I moved to London, I was constantly inspired by going to hear from different engineers and different architects in their journeys and what inspired them, whether it was particular buildings that they had worked on or people that had trained them. And it occurred to me as I was coming up to being president of iStructD that there wasn't as much of that in person these days. And at the same time, I think we need more engineers around the entire world to really feel that passion and inspiration for the profession. And when we award the gold medal, we quite often come together for the gold medal address, and then we don't often hear very much in terms of engagement from our gold medalists. So I thought it was a great opportunity to have a chat, really to create equal access to everyone to inspiring engineers and inspiring engineering. So again, thank you and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So that was a bit of a long-winded introduction. I like to start by asking, before we get into all of the accolades and the things that you do in your everyday job, what's the thing in your work or your daily kind of profession that brings you the most joy?
Oh, that's a good question.
I know it kind of it catches people off guard, but I think we quite often as engineers we talk about tangible things and delivering, engineering impact and the process behind it. But I'm really interested in the beginning about the human aspects of what we do in terms of who we are and how that manifests in what we do.
Yeah, I think for me, engineering has always been about creativity and collaboration. And it's, working with other people. There's not much you can do on your own. I'd be very bad at something if I had to be on my own all day doing it. And it's creating with other people, sharing ideas, exchanging ideas, collaborating around a common goal. I mean, if you're designing, a building or another piece of infrastructure, you're collaborating with a real intent, a real purpose to create something. And it's a sort of similar thing to sometimes I feel when I'm cooking, with the family or friends, and everyone's in the kitchen and you're drinking wine and you're cooking and you're talking and you're exchanging and saying, oh, well, maybe I could try cooking this, and it's a similar thing. And when I was younger, I played the clarinet, and what I enjoyed was playing the clarinet in an orchestra or in a chamber group or in a jazz band. But it was the same thing. It was that you're doing something, you're bringing your bit, but you're doing it with other people all the time.
I love that. So some of the things that I heard there a couple of times are collaboration and creativity, which I think is so essential. And at the beginning of our careers, we're quite often trained and focused, I think, on gaining knowledge and developing our technical skills, which is quite an individual endeavor. And quite often when we come into engineering, I don't think we're as prepared for that collaboration as perhaps we could. I remember doing a few group projects at university. But then collaboration in its most successful sense is also working under quite often big deadlines, big diverse teams. Even if it's a small project, there's quite a number of different disciplines coming together. Um, what's your kind of thoughts on collaboration when that can also be quite challenging? Because collaboration to me means, almost like a big group hug. We're working with all these amazing people, but I think the reality is it can often be challenging, right? There's different, very strong personalities, a lot of very clever people. How have you kind of worked through that in your career and come to the point where you still feel like collaboration is the essence of what we do?
Well, I think we actually have got to go beyond collaboration, but I'll come to that in a moment. I mean, firstly, I wanted to pick up on your comment about growing your technical skills. I always feel that I've had a fantastic career, and a lot of that is because I worked for and with fantastic people in my younger years, and I really enjoyed working for different people and learning from them. And when I was a graduate, I had a boss who just said, "You've got to fill your technical toolkit." And I loved the way that he described that, because it was, I wanted to work on a project and design in concrete. And then I said, okay, well, fine. Now I want to work on a project and design in timber, or I want to design in steel. So you worked on different building typologies and used different materials. And that was sort of, your toolkit, your technical toolkit. And that's the way he described it. But I actually think you're absolutely right, Tanya, because the other part of working, that same boss said to me, Jo, the technology is easy. It's people that are the difficult bit. And I replied, no, it's people that make it interesting.
It's
Because
so true.
it's working with people that makes it fun. And I've thought a lot about collaboration because there's some teaching that I do, which is actually on co-creation. But to help people understand that, I've got a model that I use, which is a sort of step model. And you start with cooperation. Cooperation is I'm doing my thing and you're doing your thing. And okay, we'll kind of, tolerate each other and try and work together. Then, of course, there's coordination. And when you first start working, particularly as a structural engineer working with architects and working with building services engineers, you have to coordinate what you're doing. And in the old days, that wasn't in a BIM model. That was looking at their drawings and thinking, how does what they're designing fit with what I'm designing? But collaboration goes a step beyond coordination, because it's actually working towards a common goal and a common vision. And really, that's what I loved about designing buildings. And I was lucky to work with some fantastic architects. And in those days, we didn't have 3D pictures and renders of buildings before they were built. So a lot of it was about really trying to get in the head and the mind and the imagination of the architect that you were working with, and really understand what they wanted the building to be. And realizing that you as a structural engineer had agency over that, depending on how you designed it, where you allowed the forces to flow. And so it was a very intense collaboration that involved developing a relationship with the architect and with the other designers. It wasn't a kind of cold and clinical exercise. I think now what I do is I like taking that beyond that to co-creation. And the difference with that is you're not just working within the bounds of the professional team, you're creating with the people who are going to use the structures that you're designing, so that you're getting their input to the design from the beginning.
I love that, and something that aligns very closely with what I'm passionate about, which is, really focusing on the positive impact we can have through our work, through that collaboration, at a time when there could be potentially a lot of focus on some of the detrimental impacts of our work as well. I think it's so powerful to make sure that we look at how we help people survive and thrive, but we do it in a way that, again, isn't in isolation, but really uses all of our skills. And in that, one of the skills that I think is strongest in structural engineers, and I don't think I realized this till quite late in my career, is creativity. I had more of a maths and science background in terms of my natural tendencies, and I have a twin who's incredibly naturally creative, and she could draw, and she was a beautiful artist, or still is. So in my mind, I wasn't creative because I didn't have those, beautiful artistic skills. And it wasn't until I realized that applying the strength of my brain in creative ways to solve problems actually was applying creativity as it meant something to me. I wish I had known that early in my career, is my point there. Let's dig into creativity a little bit more, because I do now think it's one of the sort of most central values and skills that a structural engineer can bring to any project, but any outcome as well.
I think we're all a function of the education system that we went through when we were youngsters, and I was sort of an all-rounder who was very good at maths and got encouraged to do science. But actually, what I loved all the way through my childhood was making things. I'd make models for my brother's train set. I would make clothes all the time. I was passionate about fashion, and I was always, designing clothes and, chopping up old clothes that I bought at the charity shop and making them into something else. So it was that business of creation and making things. I love cooking. All of these things are all part of creativity. But I think, rather like you, Tanya, I associated with creativity with being a brilliant artist. And I'm slightly colorblind, so I didn't do very well at art. I was very good at drawing, black and white, but when it came to paints, that was all went horribly wrong. And so it was really when I started working, university engineering is and was pretty scientific. I mean, I always talk about my engineering degrees. There was no people in it. There was no environment in it. It was very much learning how to analyze, learning about materials, learning about structural behavior. And it was only my final year we actually did a design project, and I absolutely loved it. And then, of course, when I started working, that's what it was all about. It was all about design. And we didn't have computers, were new, so we could design things that engineers hadn't really been able to design before. So I graduated in the late 80s, and one of the first projects I worked on was Stansted Airport, which is a thin lattice shell structure. But that structure was possible because computers had just enabled us to analyze thin shell structures, which of course deform and can't carry the loads in compression in the same way when they deform, and therefore in the past tended to collapse. And you need to do lots of iterative analysis, and computers meant that we could do that. And so architects were very excited about, we can have shallow, thin lattice shell structures in steel, which they couldn't have done before. And that was very exciting. And then as computers enabled us to do 2D CAD, 3D CAD, the creativity just got bigger and bigger. But we were still drawing too at that stage. So I just remember that we had rolls of tracing paper and felt pens in the office. And so, 1 minute you'd be using the computer to analyze something, and next minute you'd be drawing. We had large drawing boards. We all learned to draw big A1, A0 drawings. And those are skills that are sort of part of the craft of being an engineer, which, doing calculations by hand, that I grew up with. And, it's a different craft set now. I think engineers are equally creative, but their sort of palette is different. And much more orientated to technology. And of course, now we've got AI coming in, that will bring a whole new dimension.
It's really interesting. I was going to ask you about that in terms of what does sort of creativity look like now, but I think you're right. You know, the craft of being an engineer is always there, and it has been. But the tools that we use and the palette that we use will always be evolving, and so it should. And that's pretty exciting, actually. Um,
I think it's really exciting. And the other thing that I'm very excited about at the moment is that I think the palette of materials that we're designing in is changing. So, steel and concrete have been so dominant, over the last decades. And I very purposefully, as a young engineer, decided I wanted to learn to design in timber. And there was a wonderful person called Peter Ross who worked for Arup, and he was the timber guru. And I was designing a smallish art gallery, and I wanted to design it in timber. And I went and said, tell me how to design in timber. And I went on courses at the institution on how to design in timber. And it was like, oh, timber is this really interesting material because it's not homogeneous in the way that steel is. And I have to select it in a different way, and I have to specify it in a different way. And I thought that was like really exciting, and then I thought, well, okay, I'll try something else. And I decided I wanted to learn to design in masonry, which if you work for a big company like Arup, there's not a lot of smaller buildings that are masonry. So I sort of sought out projects where I could, learn to design in masonry, and again, went on courses, learned to design, applied it in the projects. And then I found myself as the years went on, when I was working, in different countries overseas, using other materials like rammed earth or stone masonry. And if I hadn't, I think, made a specific decision earlier in my career to use a wider palette, I wouldn't have gone down that route. And now, of course, actually material selection and trying to use materials that are lower in carbon and use less materials is a key driver in how people are designing. So it's not just about designing for functionality, but it's actually all cost. It's also designing to make sure that we're minimizing the use of resources and minimizing the amount of carbon. And just that extra dimension to what we're required to do as structural engineers means that will unlock another layer of creativity. And I suspect there'll be new forms of architecture emerging too in the next decades in response to that.
and I actually feel that we're seeing that already, with particularly clients and architects who are really, really invested in that and invested in the kind of creative process or maybe exploratory process of what that looks like. I think you're right. It potentially is a really exciting time for structural engineers. So I think exciting from a technology perspective, exciting from a sort of materials evolution perspective, and also I don't know if it's sort of constraints or drivers, but however you would sort of frame um, climate change and climate action in the context of a structural engineer. So whether that is using less materials or designing perhaps for resilience and longevity, which I think we'll touch on in a second. In terms of technical skills, one of the things that I wonder about is particularly for people sort of early to mid into their career is how to balance all of those things. So what I've seen is a lot of enthusiasm to understand the tools and to leverage particularly AI and automation in what we do. And as someone that has been working for a long time and sort of was trained with hand calculations and the joy of hand calculations, the joy of developing a gut feel, where do you think that balance comes in terms of really getting excited about engineering becoming almost a technology-driven profession versus the need for that technical craft that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I think that, my boss when I was 20 something would have probably, had the same conversation worrying about computers coming in and,
Right.
computers displacing skills like doing calculations by hand, drawing by hand. All of those things were things that were an incredibly important part of being an engineer. When I graduated, now You don't have to be able to do calculations by hand. You don't have to be able to draw by hand. You can do it all with the computer. Again, I think that what matters is that you don't have to, as a slightly, as someone sort of later in your career, need to be able to do everything. You need to understand what can be done. And so when I'm talking to some of the younger people who I work with, I don't really understand the potential of AI. I'm now trying to get to grips with it, and use it, and I'm experimenting, and sometimes it works and is helpful, and sometimes it's not. But I tend to say to some of the sort of younger, more digital natives who understand these things, they've grown up in that world, I say, I kind of want to do this. Do you think that AI could help? And they go, oh, yes, absolutely. And I say, well, could we have a meeting and could you explain? And then they do it and they show me. And so it's the craft of it, is something I'm never going to master, I don't think. I mean, I might, I'll try, but I don't think we have to be able to do everything. We need to know what skills and tools are available, and then we can harness those to realize the designs that we're trying to create. And I think the fun thing about that is I look back on my early career, and because I came in at an era where computers were important and I was good at the computers and I was good at analysis, I was working with some really, much more senior engineers, very closely. And although I was much, much younger, there was a sort of peer-to-peer relationship because I could do things that they couldn't do. And that's what I mean, that sort of the analogy of music. If you think about a band, you've got people playing different instruments, but they're all making the music together. And so I think what's really exciting is when you see mixed ages and mixed backgrounds of engineers, working together and collaborating. And I think that's particularly important because, there isn't a right way of doing things. We have to worry as engineers about making sure that what we do is safe. That's the driving force behind, what we do. We have to make sure that what we do is safe, and that it's serviceable. And then we can start thinking about, other parameters in terms of affordable, in terms of longevity, in terms of, its environmental impact. But, that's a process that requires many minds and different perspectives. And that sort of holistic approach to design, even within a discipline of structural engineering, you still need those different perspectives to come together. And I think that that's why it's exciting actually for young people to join the profession, because it's not something you have to kind of, work up your ladder and you're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z until you're, been working for 20 years. It's accumulated experience. And they'll bring things that they understand, from the get-go when they're 20s, and we'll be learning them retrospectively because that technology didn't exist.
I love that. I hadn't thought of it in that sense, but you're right. It is actually a profession that you can really get involved from the very beginning. Doesn't mean you can kind of lead from the beginning because you have to be safe, but it is something that does require everybody. And one of the things that I sort of through the latter part of my career have developed is this sort of passion for, as I said, the impact and the outcome of our work. Having started with the technical craft and then got very excited about delivering kind of larger, complex structures, I quite late moved into the impact on people and therefore collaborated with a lot of people that had probably got there a lot quicker than me and tended to be, a lot earlier in their career. And that really enhanced that thinking about the human side of what we do. So I want to kind of lean into that in terms of your career a little bit more, because I'm fascinated by your journey. And I was lucky enough to be at your gold medal address in person in 2017. And it was interesting because for me, it was the first gold medal address that really lent into the humanitarian side of engineering from a structural engineering perspective. And it was inspiring for me because I was at a point in my career where I was thinking about what next for my career. And just listening to someone who was a structural engineer who really was thinking about the impact at scale on people was incredibly inspiring. And it was sort of one of the motivations for being here this evening. So it's a kind of a long-winded introduction to saying I hope that many of our audience will also be inspired by your journey, but maybe some of them would enjoy hearing a little bit about that evolution from starting as a structural engineer and working in design. How did you get into humanitarian engineering? And I think from memory, it sort of started with really thinking about sustainable design first.
Yeah, so I feel that a career is, it's not something you can plan. It's the story that you tell about the journey that you've taken. And when I was awarded the gold medal and then had to do an address at the institution, I had to sort of think about what was that journey that I took. And when you look back, there's sort of clear points which changed the direction. You took a road that was less traveled, maybe. I grew up in the UK, and I didn't go anywhere except for 1 week on a French exchange. I didn't go abroad until I was 18 in my gap year before university. And I wanted to go and discover the world. And so in the summers when I was at university, I used to go traveling. And I just fell in love with the fact that there's a whole world out there and I want to travel. And so when I graduated, and my father said, "What are you going to do when you graduate?" And I said, "I'm going to go and work in India." And it was one of those bold statements that you make when you're 21. I had no idea how I was going to go and work in India. But having told my father I was going to, I, of course, had to live up to that expectation. And so I kept asking people all the time, do you know anything about India? Do you know anything about India? I mean, there was no internet. You couldn't, I don't know how I did it. But, through meeting people and meeting people and meeting people, I got this incredible job working in the jungle in central India. And I spent 9 months working in the jungle in central India, and it was absolutely pivotal to my life because I sort of lived up close and personal with nature, and I just fell in love with nature, and really began to sort of see how animals depended on other animals and depended on plants and that ecosystem. But also I was living in a village where there was no running water or electricity. And so I also became very well aware of how people depended on infrastructure to enable them to meet their daily needs. And, I found myself just making a little solar panel so that I could have a hot shower. Not, because it was freezing cold and I didn't like cold showers. And, I built a house in the jungle camp that I worked in out of local materials. And that was a very formative year. And it was because of that experience that 5 years later, when I came across a charity called rigour, which is Registered Engineers for Disaster Relief, they were interested in me, signing up to be a rigour member because I'd had some experience working overseas already. And rigour is an amazing charity started by an engineer called Peter Guthrie. And he realized that, in refugee situations or situations where people are internally displaced, you need engineering skills, to fix the roads, to build shelters, to build distribution centers, etc., and water supply systems. And so I became a member of rigour and then spent weekends, in Cambridge or in Bristol, learning how to design water supply systems, learning about emergency shelter, filling a different toolbox, I suppose, a toolbox that equipped me to be a humanitarian engineer. And then I ended up then getting called up to go on an assignment. First of all, in 1992 to go to Kurdistan during the Iraq War, but I said goodbye to Arab and said, "Could I have a leave of absence? I'm off to do this." And then Saddam Hussein rounded up everyone in the car park, and it was too dangerous, and so they cancelled it. So I came back to work. And then in 1994, during the Rwandan genocide, I got asked to go and work in northwest Tanzania. So it was mass refugee movements of people fleeing the Rwandan genocide into northern Tanzania. Where I first arrived was a camp called Ngara Banako that had 400,000 people had arrived overnight, and it was suddenly the second biggest city in Tanzania, and there was nothing, And week one, we were giving out plastic sheeting and trying to secure the water source to prevent it getting contaminated. And 3 months later, it was a town. It had hospitals, it had roads, it had streets. And it was that experience that really made me realize, gosh, I've managed to study a subject and learn some skills that can really make a difference to people. And I remember being interviewed by journalists when I came back, and they said, "You're so brave to have done that." And I said, "I'm not brave. I'm just really lucky." Most people, when they see, terrible things happening in other parts of the world, they can donate, which is really important. But I could do more than that. I could roll up my sleeves and go out and help. And that was really the beginning of a journey of really thinking about the role of engineering in supporting, people living on the planet, and brokering that relationship between the ever increasing number of people that we've got on the planet and their needs, and the ability of the planet to meet those needs. And that's really what the essence of sustainable development is all about, is balancing that equation.
I mean, it's quite remarkable. It's a remarkable story, and the impact is remarkable, particularly at scale. And I want to hear more about it. But the burning question that I have, I guess, is I hear from a lot of younger engineers and sort of members I've met this year and in moving around representing ISTRAT, is a lot of people, I guess, feel that if they don't work for a big organization or they don't have those opportunities to have impact at scale, it's challenging for them to feel like they're making a difference, which I disagree with, because I think if we've worked hard to gain that toolkit that you've talked about, and we apply it in sort of meaningful and positive ways, each one of us makes a meaningful difference. What's your perspective on that? Having created these opportunities and then taken them, whether they were conscious or not, that's just one story. I've heard many more from you, and we'll get into it about your impact at scale. But for people that perhaps have not had that experience or that opportunity yet, how do you think collectively we can have impact on society and humanity moving forward?
So to me, so much of it is about a mindset. I can talk about what I do as a structural engineer in terms of the outputs that I create. So I'm designing a school, or I'm designing a station, or I'm designing a wind turbine. I can talk about those things in terms of the outputs. But it's much more interesting for one's friends and family if you talk to them about the outcomes of what you're doing. So I can say, I'm actually designing a school, but what's really exciting about this school is that this school is in a really deprived area of the country, and it's replacing a real failed school, and it's an academy school. And it's going to change the lives of children in that area, because they're going to get a much better educational facility than they could ever get before. And then when I go to that school, I'm actually making a difference. What I'm doing as a structural engineer in contributing to the design of that school, that's making a difference to 2,000 kids every year who are going to go to that school. And you multiply that up by 30 years, and you've made a difference to, I think, if I get the math right, 60,000 kids. And that makes me feel good. When I was designing Wembley Park, London Underground station, I discovered that Wembley Park was the busiest station outside of the Circle Line, outside of the main interchange stations with on the Circle Line. And then, of course, on match days, it was absolutely rammed. And the motivation for redesigning the station was to make it safer during match days. And I got like really excited about designing the station because I was making sure that football fans, and particularly, if you're a family taking young kids to football, you don't want it's very scary being caught up in a football crowd. You want to be able to get there on public transport with your family and safely. So being able to widen platforms and widen over bridges, and allow people to get off the train and safely to the stadium, you're doing something that's really purposeful, that's making a difference to people's lives. And then, of course, on a daily basis, all those commuters going through the station were having a much better experience, in terms of traveling to work. And traveling to and from work, well, it certainly used to be a big part of all our lives. It's a slightly, if we're doing hybrid working, we don't do it quite so often, maybe not 5 days a week. But actually, your journey to work makes a difference to how you feel about, going to work. And so I think that, we can retreat to being, the technical prowess and our technical achievements. And I think that those are fantastically important. But I think as a profession, what we do as structural engineers and as civil engineers, is we're designing, and I talk about designing the stage set on which life plays out. And, in doing that, we're making a really significant contribution to society. And that's what motivated me actually originally to study engineering. It wasn't a love of technology. It was actually, I want to do something useful for society. And I was talking to a group of young women who were doing A-levels about engineering. And one of them came up to me afterwards and said, I was planning to be a doctor until I heard you talk. But now I've realized that engineers are the doctors of society. And I'm going to be an engineer. And, I thought that was just beautiful that we're the doctors of society. And, we're doing things that are really essential. I'm proud of being an engineer. And, one thing I look back on, I don't regret the fact that I became an engineer. I actually think that was a lucky choice, and I've had a very interesting time.
I love that. Engineers are the doctors of society. I heard somebody describe an idea for National Engineering Day. If they shut down everything that engineers had worked on, people would very quickly understand what a structural engineer does. And I think it's similar in terms of being inspiring when you start to think about how essential our profession is. I think engineering is so inspiring, and I'm really enjoying hearing from you in terms of your perspectives of it. But I'm challenged sometimes by younger people that are caught up in some of the more traditional perspectives on engineering as being quite boring. A lot of people say, isn't engineering quite boring? Isn't it just on site and construction? Isn't it one of the biggest contributors to global warming? What are some of the ways that you tackle those challenges in your current role, which I guess is a steward of engineering, and particularly sort of in global development and sustainability? Because it certainly is something that I don't necessarily have any answers on, other than to focus on, like you said, the story behind it and the impact of our work.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, people have perspectives and form perspectives, based around the sort of information and knowledge that they have access to. And I think one of the challenges for engineering as a profession generally has been, it's not a subject that's taught in school. And it's not a subject that most school teachers understand. The closest that anyone gets to it at school is design and technology. And then everyone's growing up in a world where they're surrounded by, tech, and they're very familiar with tech. It's in their hands from a young age. And so, I've always been very keen on the schools outreach programs that, are getting into schools and getting people to design things with spaghetti, or, things like that. Really helping people understand that engineering and design are very closely intertwined. Engineering, design, technology, we're bringing them all together, and that I think is really important. And I think there could be much more done to help teachers understand engineering as a career and understand the different branches of engineering as a career, the difference between a structural engineer and a civil engineer and a mechanical engineer and an aeronautical engineer. Because I fell into it by accident. I mean, I fell into it because someone at school said, you better think about what you do. And there was a Rolodex and it started with A. And I went through, accountant, actuary, B, banker. And I was like, B, it was boring. All of it was boring. And then I got to E and it was engineering. And it was like, oh, well, you can design things. And I thought, well, that's exciting. So I think that, we've got to overcome that side of things. I think then people do want to do something positive for society. So the stories we tell about what we do and the role we play, we need to tell better stories about what we do to bring it home, to make people realize actually the role that engineers play. And that just doesn't really happen enough. And then we can do things individually. I mean, when I started working, there weren't that many women engineers. There was opportunities. Can we do an article about you? And it was always, can we take a photograph of you on a building site with a hard hat? And I just said no. I actually loved working on building sites. I didn't mind that at all, but I didn't want to perpetuate that stereotypical view that an engineer, wore a big high-vis jacket and big boots and had a hard hat. So I said, no, but you can take a picture of me in the office with my drawing board. And actually they said, but you'll look like an architect. And I said, well, what I do isn't that different from an architect. It's just, we're both designing buildings. We're coming from different perspectives. And probably the craziest thing that I did, along that lines was I was approached by the Royal Academy of Engineers years ago and said they'd realized that the reason that women didn't go into engineering was because they felt that it was a sort of male profession and you wore that big high-vis jacket and boots. And they said that part of that was the mothers who didn't understand it as a profession. And so they wanted me to do an article for Vogue magazine to appeal to the mothers that engineering was a valid career and that you could wear a dress and you could look glamorous and be an engineer. So I think, we have to be careful about, I think the important thing is to have conversations, particularly with young people, about, what are they interested in? And then to help them understand that, they can follow their interests and it might lead them to this career. And then I think we also have to really look after people who come into the profession and make sure that they really can see the value in what they're doing. They're given the opportunity to deliver value. And I think the final thing that I think is maybe a bit challenging is, although I said you don't have to wait 20 years to do things. You can qualify as a structural engineer after about 4 years, and you're qualified legally to take responsibility for designing buildings. And really, helping people see that as a real milestone in the way becoming a doctor is a real milestone. And which is certainly how I saw becoming a structural engineer. I was just so proud of, I'm a professional person now. And I think that that's also something that we don't think about enough. I think, people come out of university and they want to know what the next step is, and actually explaining that to get from being a graduate engineer to being a professional chartered engineer, that's a big achievement that will stand you in good stead, just like getting a degree stands you in good stead. And everyone talks about architects studying for 7 years and it's so long and they don't get qualified. Well, being a structural engineer is no different. And it's really important because I think the other thing that characterizes structural engineers is that we're very rigorous thinkers and we think through things. And I think that's simply because we actually design things and we draw the drawings that contractors build from. And so we have to dot every I and cross every T. We have to make sure that what is on the drawing is correct, because that is what's built. And there's a rigor in that, which is a sort of discipline, it's a practice, which you learn in your 20s, and it stands you in good stead, all the way through your professional life, whatever you're doing, is to really think through a problem. So when someone says to me, why are engineers effective as leaders of organizations, or why are engineers effective in working in humanitarian situations, I think it is creativity, I think it is collaboration. But the third one, I think, is it's actually rigor of thought. And it's also, the final thing I'd say to young engineers, it's my career really, is, you start doing one thing and you just grow and learn and develop. And when I first started, it was all about technical parameters. And as my career's progressed, I've got interested in other parameters, the outcome on people, or the impact on nature, or the amount of carbon that's used. But I've not done the same thing for 35, maybe a few more years. It's evolved, and that's really what's interesting about it. Is you're embarking on a journey, and you become a professional, and then as you go through and continue your journey, you just add more skills to what you're doing, more perspectives. And it's the practice of being a structural engineer. And the more you practice at anything, the better you get.
Wow, there's a lot there. I love that. I love that combination. I haven't heard that before, but I think it's really true. That combination of deep rigor and creativity and collaboration, and so many other aspects, I guess, in terms of thinking of the impact on the environment and on people. But in terms of developing those traits, I think that's a really great way of expressing the importance of being an engineer and bringing and developing those skills. What strikes me as well as your comments on the diversity of your career journey and the diversity of the profession, which again I think is really exciting. So I think it would be remiss of me not to dig in a little bit before we close on some of your honorary doctorates and your research, because we've sort of focused on the early parts of your design career and your humanitarian work. Tell me a bit more about that in terms of, was that something from a research and from an academic perspective, was that something that is a common thread throughout your career, or is it something that developed further into it?
I think it was something that arose really through curiosity. And to understand things, I like reading about things, and so I read a lot to become better at being a humanitarian engineer. And then when I got into development work, thinking about engineering in the context of working in the global south, in Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America, I had to read, and a lot of what I was doing was work in pioneering areas. And so it would be working in flood resistant housing in Pakistan. Well, the first thing I'd do is, okay, who's written about flood resistant housing in Pakistan? And the answer was nobody. But there were some people in Bangladesh who had done some really fantastic work and research on that. So to me, it was a sort of information on, I wanted to know what people had done before so that I could employ that and build on that. And that's very different to, I think, working, say, in the UK, where you're designing something that the starting point is codes of practice. When you're working in emerging economies, there aren't necessarily good codes of practice. They're quite often very out of date. So you actually have to think about, am I going to use a European code or am I going to use a UK code? And then you actually have to think about the materials. They're not just like off the shelf and you can guarantee their quality. You've actually got to think about, think about more about how the provenance of those materials. And so really that sort of need to go further upstream, combined with the curiosity, led me to really sort of delve into academia. And then I got an opportunity. I was approached by a college in Cambridge, Sydney Sussex College, and this was in around, I don't know, about 1999, 2000, and they were looking for a real life engineer. They wanted someone to be a part-time fellow to engage with the students with their design projects, at the end of the year. And that gave me half a day to teach the students and half a day to think. And I just loved having that space to think, to read, to study, to learn. And that's what really gave me the opportunity to sort of think about sustainable development. And then when I started, working in humanitarian situations and then started the international development business at Arup, so much of what we were doing was new. And I think I enjoyed the discipline of writing peer-reviewed articles. And, because it'll get chucked out, it won't get published unless what you're doing is really pioneering. And so it was a way of, it was almost a way of celebrating with the team, who'd worked on something, to say, let's write an article about this and let's get this article published, maybe in the Institute of Structural Engineers magazine, maybe in something else. But we knew that it had to be really rigorous, the thought process to what we'd done. And we knew that it would be independently reviewed and challenged. And that actually then also gives you confidence that what you've done is as progressive as you thought it was. And I think actually that's the whole way the profession's evolved. Is, again, it's another form of collaboration and sharing. It's a way of giving back your experience and sharing that with other people, so other people can build on that experience. And I think that's also very important in the role that the institutions play, because the institutions are a convener and distributor of knowledge, and people working in very big firms like myself will participate in institution activities, share knowledge that comes from what we're doing. The institution will make sure that knowledge reaches all kinds of people in much smaller firms. But then it also gives people in smaller firms who are being really innovative and creative and doing new things. And that's particularly important now with sort of firms that are sort of focusing on new materials. That knowledge needs to come into the institution, and then through the institution, someone will come across it in a bigger organization and amplify it. And that's really what I've learned, is about how change gets created at scale. It's not by one person doing a big thing. It's actually about doing something, and then it's the ripple effect of that work. And for me, the most significant ripple effect I've probably had is some amazing work that I had the opportunity to lead, which was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, which is to explore what city resilience means. And what does the resilience of a city mean? And what contributes to the resilience of a city? And it isn't just the infrastructure, it's all sorts of other things. And I led a very lengthy and deep research project, which resulted in something called the City Resilience Framework. This was 10 years ago. We've just published a further version of it. And that framework was then picked up by something called the 100 Resilient Cities Programme, which then became the Resilient Cities Network. And it's been used to guide the planning in over 100 cities globally. And probably my latest count is, I think, 170. But
wow, that's amazing.
The influence is huge. And I didn't set out to do that. But you could take any innovation in structural engineering and just look at that ripple effect. And that's really, I think, how individually we have the biggest impact. It's not a direct thing. It's a kind of quieter thing, and maybe we never know, and that doesn't matter.
Although I think often when we look back, we do know, right? Sometimes I think as a profession, maybe we're too humble because we're part of a collaborative. I think we focus quite often on delivery. I think it is important to take a moment and recognize that impact at scale, even if we're just part of that ripple effect.
Yeah,
and
I think you mentioned it earlier, Tanya. I mean, whatever work one does, there are deadlines. You know, if you're in publishing, it's a deadline every week. If it's a weekly magazine, you know, I couldn't cope with that kind of pressure week on week on week. You know, if you're a structural engineer, there are periods of intense productivity, you know, deadlines to meet. You know, we have to deal as engineers with all kinds of, you know, legal and contractual issues, you know, but in addition to, but you know, those are very pragmatic parts of the profession, but they're combined with the other things we talked about earlier, and the fact that it is a profession that involves other people, it involves working together, it involves making a positive difference on people's lives. And I think, you know, going forwards, will become increasingly important, because as we accommodate more and more people living on the planet, we're going to need to design more and more structures, whether those are bridges or buildings or, you know, wind turbines. You know, we need more infrastructure to meet the needs of the people living on the planet. And we've got to be even more creative about how we're designing it, because we've got to design it in a way that ensures that it is as long lasting as possible, because that's the best way to reduce its impact on resources and carbon, is to take a whole life cycle approach. And we need to be thinking beyond the end of its lifespan to what happens to all the materials locked up in that building when that building's past its useful life. How can it be dismantled? How can that all those materials be salvaged and reused and repurposed? And you know, that's a whole temporal dimension. It's not just designing an X, Y, and Z. It's designing an X, Y, and Z and time as well. And then, you know, we've just published a report at COP16, which was with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And that was looking at the nature impact of buildings. And it's not actually about the immediate, that report isn't talking about the impact of a building on site. It's actually saying we need to think about the nature impact as a result of the materials that are used in the building. Just like we think about embodied carbon, we need to think about embodied nature, and to think about what has been the impact of nature in extracting those materials, in transporting those materials, in manufacturing those materials, not just on carbon, but on biodiversity, on water consumption. And that then challenges us to think about a whole lot of other issues. And I think it's by the core of being a structural engineer is about materials, it is about structural behavior, it is about making sure that structures are safe as the number one. But beyond that, there are layers and layers of considerations, which I think is what makes it, you know, a really rewarding profession for many more people. It's not just a tech thing. It's technical plus.
I agree.
And that, you know, I think you know, the young people I meet who want to go into engineering, you know, mostly they're very excited. And I also think that, you know, when I come to the institution, you know, structural engineers are a happy bunch of people. When you talk to them, they've generally had a pretty interesting life. You know, you have, I have, and I think that goes for, you know, a lot of people in the profession, who look back and think, yeah, you know, I'm glad I did this. It's been good.
I agree. I feel incredibly privileged. I don't know that I knew that at the beginning of my career, because I was so focused on what engineering was. But when I look back on how lucky I've been, I just feel inspired to share that with, you know, younger people who might be thinking about being in the profession, or wondering what's next after a couple of years in. So we're nearly out of time. One question I like to finish with, and again, something I'm asked a lot, is, well, that's all well and good, but you know, you've been in the profession for quite some time now, so you can, get involved in these projects. What's one thing that people who are listening today can take away into their everyday lives tomorrow to make a difference?
Well, I'm not sure that it's an answer that will necessarily appeal to everyone, but I think we all have to take responsibility for ourselves, and for the choices that we make, and we then have to recognize the fact that we have a degree of agency, and influence, and it's up to us whether we actually want to use that agency to do things differently. And sometimes that requires us to be a bit braver than perhaps we want to be, or a bit pushier than we want to be. I was, by nature, I'm an introvert. I grew up in a big family. I was the only sort of introvert in my family, so I kind of learned to be assertive, learned to sort of speak up. It still costs me, and it's not natural. I sort of do it, but I have to, I have to push myself to speak up and to say, I'd like to get involved in that, or I'd like to do this, or, I want to try something different. And I think that it's about, so much comes from within oneself, and following one's passion, seizing opportunities, when they arise. It's I look back and think there are moments in my life where I've been very fortunate and someone's given me a leg up. But a lot of the real opportunities have been because something was happening, and I put my hand up and I said, I'd really like to get involved in that. And so I think it's, sometimes when people feel a bit stuck, it's easy to say it's the fault of the organization I'm working for, or I chose the wrong profession. But actually, the best thing probably to do in those circumstances is find someone to talk to, find someone to talk to who's a bit older than you, who's prepared to listen, and see if you can think about it in a different way. And when I'm stuck, I always think, well, there's one thing that I can't control that will change everything, and that's time. So whatever's going on now, it will be different in 6 months' time. So maybe I should just stick through this patch, get the most out of it that I can, and see where I end up in 6 months. But life's not predictable. We've got to be agile and responsive to what the world throws at us, and really engage with it. And I think that is something that has really stood me in good stead. I get up every morning and I want to make a positive impact. I want to be a better person, and I don't always get it right. None of us gets it right, whether it's my children or with colleagues. But the point is, one keeps trying, and it's an art. It's not a destination. It's a journey that we're all on.
I love that. And I think it's, for me, it's so refreshing to hear that, it's not all planned out, but a lot of it is within our control. So you can't necessarily control what comes along, but you can control whether to take it. You can control how much effort you put into the study, or the curiosity, or the creativity, or you described that feeling of being stuck. And I talked about a moment in my career, I guess 7, 8 years ago, when I was feeling stuck, but listening to some of your career journey, and then finding people in the institution who had also led really interesting professional lives to talk to, was really, really amazing. And that's one of the reasons I was passionate about creating or expanding mentoring at IStructE, so that everyone had access to that, not just when you become chartered, but that's really, I think, when the career starts, and making sure that, there are people to continuously inspire us. So really appreciate that reminder.
Yeah, and it's more than inspiration. That it's. I think it's an apprenticeship thing.
It's
when you
true.
start your career, you're learning from people, and a mentor is someone who's giving you the benefit of their perspective and their advice. And I think it's really important that people have mentors, not just for inspiration, but for advice. And I I was lucky. My dad, when I was 15 years old, I I obviously said something not very nice in the way that 15-year-old girls do. And my dad just said to me, "Jo, I want to explain something to you. You're my third daughter. I know a lot about 15-year-old girls. And one thing I want to be clear is I'm not telling you what to do. I'm giving you my advice." And he then said, "And I recommend you take my advice, but it's up to you." But I always remember that because I've never been shy of asking for advice. I will, and to me, that's what mentorship about is finding someone wiser than me, with more experience than me, ask for advice, or sometimes now I'll actually ask someone younger who knows more about technology than me, but ask for the advice, but then I will take responsibility for the decisions that I make. And I think that's what I would commend that as a way, commend that to anyone. It's a profession where people are willing to help each other. There's lots of knowledge out there. We can all ask for advice, but we've then got to take responsibility for the decisions we make on the projects that we're doing and the career decisions we make. But most people have more agency than they think, and there's more in their control or more that they can influence than they think.
I love that. Thank you. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up. It's been a really wonderful and insightful conversation, and I feel like we could keep talking for a lot longer. There's a lot that I'll take away from it, and no doubt our audience will as well. Again, just thank you for your time, but also your generosity in sharing your insights. I think that's what's really special about these is it's not just the delivery of projects and professional journey, but it's who you are as a person and how that comes into your work that I was hoping to hear from and really learned so much more. So with that, thanks again, and I hope everyone listening really enjoys it and look forward to hearing the feedback. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Tanya. Thank you.